everyone, and welcome to Homecooked History, the show where we try to recreate historic recipes in today's contemporary kitchen. My name is Megan, and I am your host. I am also a Top Chef fan of the show on television. I'm not a professional chef myself, but I am a professional historian, and today I'm going to be attempting to recreate a traditional American dish, squash pie. So we're making squash pie today, which is really special because squash is a distinctly American crop. It has long roots in Native American history and foodways. And for white European colonists, it transitioned over time from a saving grace that prevented starvation to a traditional, widespread, and easily accessible comfort food. Pumpkin pie may be the flashier and more well-known, but squash pie, which we're going to be paying homage to today, is a truly historical and important dish. And honestly, from what I hear, it's just as tasty. So we'll see. We're also going to need butter for this recipe because according to the cookbook author or editor, pumpkin pie is naturally more oily, I guess, than the squash pie, and so it needs a little extra fat or oils, so it calls for 2 tablespoons of butter. We're also going to need a pie crust, and I normally like to make my crust by hand or, make crust from scratch, but I don't want to today, so I'm going to use a pre-made crust, and you can feel free to do that as well. In her description of this squash pie recipe, the cookbook editor Ruth Berolzheimer described the squash pie introduction in the following way. The yellow hard-shelled squash makes almost as good pies as pumpkin and is often easier to obtain. The recipe that we're using today comes from a historic cookbook called The American Woman's Cookbook, and it was revised and edited by Ruth Berolzheimer and published in Chicago in 1939. But other recipes for squash pie had appeared in cookbooks before then, including the Pentucket Housewife, a manual for housekeepers and collection of recipes, which was published in 1882. So we see recipes throughout the 19th and 20th century being published for squash pie, pretty consistent in the flavor profiles and in the ingredients. It's interesting because, like pumpkin pie, some of the recipes call for the maker to actually put the squash through a sieve, but it doesn't look like we have to do that for this recipe, so I guess that's a good thing. Okay, so step 1 is going to be roasting our squash. We're going to set our ovens at a temperature of 350. We're going to divide the squash into 2 parts, so we're going to half it, and then we're going to lay it face down on a baking sheet, and it's going to bake for about an hour. Hopefully this will make it nice and soft for our pie filling. According to the Library of Congress, the word squash comes from a Narragansett Native American word, askutasquash, which means eaten raw or uncooked. Squashes are some of the oldest known crops. Some estimates suggest that they were consumed 10,000 years ago at some sites in Mexico, and there is evidence of squash dating back 12,000 years that was found in Ecuadorian caves. So the seeds and the fleshy insides of the squash eventually became a really important part of the pre-Columbian Native American diet in both South America and North America. Some estimates suggest that Native Americans were cultivating and consuming squash 4,000 years before the domestication of maize or corn. So really, really old crop, really important to the Native American diet. So our squash is halved and we have it on the baking sheet. Our oven is ready to go, and we're going to put it in for 1 hour at 350 degrees. Then we'll take it out and move on from there. Native American tribes throughout the Northeast, Southeast, and Southwest all grew squashes. In the Southwest, squash was grown and eaten extensively by the Pueblo tribes, as well as the Apaches, Hopi, Navajo, Papago, Pima, Zuni, and Navajo tribes, amongst others. Squash were eaten at all levels of ripeness, and the tribes would roast or boil the squashes in the coals of a fire, and they preserved the flesh in syrup. Strips of squash were laid out in the sun to dry and then stored for use in winter. They also ate the young shoots, leaves, flowers, and seed from the squash. So we see the squash appearing as a really versatile food, right, in the early Native American diet. Even the seeds were removed, dried, roasted, and spiced. In the Americas, squash was one of 3 primary crops, known as the Three Sisters by the Iroquois. The other 2 crops were maize and beans, and all of these were symbiotic. They were able to grow simultaneously, which is why they kind of took on this agricultural and spiritual symbolism. They were that important to Native American culture. And winter squash were an especially important crop for the Wampanoag Indians in New England because they could be stored throughout the winter. So again, very sustainable, very long-lasting, super hearty vegetable. Virginia and New England settlers experienced hardships and hunger, and eventually adopted squash and pumpkins as food staples. Squashes were baked, cut, and moistened with animal fat, maple syrup, and honey. The original Thanksgiving took place in 1621, celebrating the successful cultivation of crops like the squash in the New World, thanks to help from the indigenous tribes, including the Wampanoag. All squash, commonly referred to as pumpkins, gourds, and squashes, originated in the New World, and that's what makes it a distinctly American crop. In fact, Cindy Ott, author of Pumpkin, The Curious History of an American Icon, says that up until the 19th century, the words pumpkin and squash were used interchangeably. Fun fact, most all of our domesticated squash that we enjoy today actually come from just 5 species. Squashes were unknown in Europe until the late 16th century. The first known record of squash dates back to 1591. Early Europeans such as De Soto, Coronado, and Cartier all saw melons in the Americas, which were actually probably squash. After traveling with the Iroquois tribe in 1636, one French visitor wrote, "The squashes last sometimes 4 and 5 months and are so abundant that they are to be had for almost nothing, and so good that on being cooked in the ashes they are eaten as apples in France." And in his account of the Dutch colony of New Netherland in 1655, Adrian van der Donck made several observations about squashes and pumpkins. He also commented that the English, who are very fond of tasty food, like pumpkins very much and use them also in pies and know how to make beverages from them. So squash in a variety of forms, including pie, was popular from the 16th century onward. Fast forward to the 19th century and you have restaurants serving squash pie for dessert, such as the Tremont House in 1847 and Hardee's Delmonico Lunch in 1868, both of which were located in Boston. And recipes were published in newspapers, such as the Orangeburg News and Times in South Carolina in May 1877 and the Hayes Free Press in Kansas in December 1910. So again, we see a widespread regional consumption of squash in different ways for many, many centuries. Recalling his childhood in Connecticut, Mr. George Richmond reminisced in 1938 that you couldn't get oranges and fresh fruits. Pineapple came high. So they used to put a lot of pear and peaches. My mother used to make 75 to 100 jars of fruit and berries in the fall. We used to have squash pies in the fall too, but we'd keep the hard squash, Hubbard squash, until Christmas to make Christmas pies. So again, even throughout the early 20th century, we're still seeing this reliance on squash to create tasty and comforting seasonal dishes. Historical note, Japanese Americans that were actually confined in the Manzanar War Relocation Center in California were served squash pie for Thanksgiving in 1942 in the midst of World War II. This recipe seems to be really, really easy to make with pretty minimal ingredients and stuff that everybody probably has around their house for the most part. So as our squash is baking, we're going to combine the rest of the ingredients into a bowl as we wait for that squash flesh to kind of soften up. Okay, it is time to pull our roasted squash out of the oven and see how we did. The squash is out of the oven and it looks beautiful. It's got a great deep color. It's really soft, and so I think it should be pretty easy to get out of the shell. We're going to start by taking a spoon and removing the seeds. You can keep those and use them for another recipe if you want, but we're finished with them for this particular recipe. And then you're gonna take your spoon and scoop out the softened squash flesh and add it to the mixture, to the bowl of everything else that's ready to go. So that's gonna be what we're doing now. I may or may not have cheated a little bit and used my handheld immersion blender. But it's super smooth. Looks good. It actually smells really, really good. It smells like fall. Oh my gosh. So now it's time to put it into the pie crust. It's beautiful! I love it, I love it, I love it. It smells great, it looks great, and it is going into the oven right now. And now we wait. The recipe instructs us to start baking the pie at 450 and then to turn down the heat after that to 325 and to cook the pie until a knife comes out clean in the middle. And also it warns us not to let the pie boil because it'll make it watery. So there's no times that are specifically listed. So I'm going to start at 450 for about 15 minutes and then drop it down after that and see how it goes. The timer finally went off, so we are going to pull our completed squash pie out of the oven. The aroma in here is incredible. It smells really, really good. So I can't wait to see what it looks like. What? Oh my gosh, it's so pretty. Oh, look at that texture. So if you decide that you want to garnish your pie, the recipe, one of the historic recipes mentions that you can add things like cranberries, stuff like that. And they specifically mention nut meats, which I'm guessing is like the inside of a nut. So I am going to put some walnuts on top of this just for some added flavor and some added texture. It's fall, y'all. It smells really incredible. The texture's super even. The color's really pretty. So far, this is going really, really well. I guess we'll see if those high marks hold up during the taste test. So here's our finished product. This is really beautiful looking, actually. I'm super happy with the way that it turned out. Brian, what do you think about the final look?
Looks yummy.
You ready for a piece?
I am.
Okay.
What would you give it on appearance?
I think it's a 9. So my crust kind of fell apart a little bit when I was getting it out, but that's a good looking slice of pie. It keeps its height, it's really dense, beautiful color. I think it's very pretty, so I'm gonna say a 9.
Okay. How's it smell?
Caramely, kind of, like nutty and caramely and like warm baked smelling. Even though it's had time to kind of cool down, it smells really, really good. So I'm gonna say a 9 as well.
All right, go in for the taste test.
Yeah, that's really good. It's hard to believe that that's squash. You know, I know it's that pumpkin and squash are really similar, but like it's kind of funny to me that it's squash. I like it. I'd say a 9 as well. I think you're right. Maybe a little bit more sweetness. Like maybe if I had put in a little bit more sugar, or like a little thing of ice cream or whipped cream on top, but it's perfect, really. It tastes great.
I think so too. Very tasty. Probably my favorite home-cooked history meal so far.
What? It's good. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Home-Cooked History. Today we tackled the hearty but super satisfying squash pie, and it was really, really good, so definitely recommend that you all try this one at home. We really appreciate you continuing to watch us as we go through this food and history journey, and hope that you tune in next time for another episode. Until then, past or present, everybody's got to eat. Take care.